Hey everyone, Matt here from Operation Wild, which is a project of A Rocha, Canada. Thanks for tuning in today. We're going to spend a little bit of time learning about ecosystems. But before we do that, I invite you to think about what you had for breakfast today. It might seem like a bit of a strange question, but think about what you had for breakfast and maybe what would happen if you didn't have breakfast today. And why is breakfast so important? I love breakfast. Part of the reasons that we all should be having breakfast is that it gives us the energy that we need for our day to go out and do whatever we do during the day. So the food that we eat and the liquids that we drink, they're so important to us because they give us energy to go do the things that we enjoy to do during the day. And as I look around me, you see lots of trees and plants and animals, and it's not that different for nature. It too needs energy to survive and to thrive and to do the things that it enjoys doing as well. Whether they're trees, small plants, big plants, animals, insects, all these different things need energy just like we do to survive and to grow and to live. So like I mentioned, we are going to learn a little bit about ecosystems, what makes them unique, but also really complex and cool at the same time, but also how different ecosystems are unique and different from each other. So when I say the word ecosystem, what things come to mind? What is an ecosystem? So you might think of food, or we already talked about energy and how that is important in an ecosystem, or other things you might think of is a food web, or a food chain is something you may have heard before, or plants or animals or all the other different things that make up an ecosystem. But when we talk about an ecosystem, we like to define it as a community of interacting organisms all in one physical place or environment. That's kind of how we like to think of as an ecosystem. So we are going to play a quick game to kind of review a specific ecosystem and how it all works and how it's all tied together. And then we're going to go look at a few different ecosystems at Cedar Haven here. So beside me here, I have a board with 6 different images of a different part of a specific ecosystem. So this ecosystem represents our Grasslands ecosystem, which we're going to actually go visit soon. But we're going to look at different parts of this and see if we can figure out what order they go in the ecosystem or in their food chain. So the food chain is how the energy is passed on through the ecosystem. So let's quickly review what these images are, and then we'll slowly work through what order that we think that they go in. So first off, closest to me here, we have a photo of a bird. And then moving over here, we have the sun and cloud and some rain. And here we have 3 different kinds of insects. We have a butterfly, we have a grasshopper, and an ant. Then up here we have some small plants and shrubs. So we have, looks like a dandelion here with some seeds coming off of it, as well as a small branch from a tree here. And then here we have some sort of small mammal. It looks kind of like a raccoon. And the last here, this is representing dirt. You can see there's a shovel here, so dirt or soil or the earth. So when we think of all these things, if we had to put them in order of how the energy fuels this ecosystem, where would things fall and where would we start? So the first thing we're going to start with is down here is the sun. So this is the most important part of basically all our ecosystems, as everything else relies on the sun and the rain and the clouds to give everything else its energy. So if this is our first piece of the ecosystem, the next spot we're going to move is over up to here, which is our soil and our earth, where the next part of our ecosystem is going to grow. So after we go from the sun and the rain up to the soil and the earth, then we're going to move over here to our plants, because that's what they're going to use, what they've gained from the sun and the clouds and the soil to grow. And from here, from these plants and small trees and branches, we're going to move over to our insects, so our butterflies, our grasshoppers, and ants, as they are going to gain their energy from these small plants. And then from here, we're going to move over to our birds, as they're going to get their energy from the small insects that they're going to be eating. And last off, from the bird, we're going to move up to our raccoon or our mammals. So they're going to be getting their energy from the birds that they might be eating. There might be some interaction between, but that's kind of the general flow of the grassland ecosystem. And a lot of ecosystems will follow this pattern roughly, but as we'll notice as we walk around, there'll be different parts that are being missing or changed based on the ecosystem. But this is kind of the general flow of how ecosystems work, from sun to earth, to plants, to insects, to birds, and to mammals.
Hey everybody, we're now in a grassland ecosystem like we saw in the flashcard game. What we're looking at here is an area that's mostly dominated by grasses. So they're just starting to grow up now, but we see a lot of the old grasses from last summer. But the new green grass is starting to grow up. And in a grassland ecosystem, one thing that you get a lot of is insects. So there's insects under the dead grass, there's insects that will live in the tall grass, and what that's great for is birds. Birds love to eat insects. And the birds that you might see flying around here and that we set up these nest boxes for are called aerial insectivores. And that means that what they do is they fly around, and without landing, they grab bugs out of the air and off of grass like this. So this is a really, really great area for birds and insects. And one of the really cool things is if you see how all the dead grass is matted on the ground, this is actually a cover throughout the winter and the spring months before it all blows away for mice. So mice actually create tunnels under grass in grassland areas to connect to their homes so they can find food and so they can be sheltered. But what happens is when the snow melts and the sun comes out and the grass starts to blow away, their tunnels open up. And what that means is that big, big birds that are raptor birds, which means that they are they're predators and they eat meat, will actually then be able to see the mice. So the springtime is really, really cool to see all these ecosystems open up, and there's so many more things interacting. The other thing you'll notice is that there are trees. So some grasslands don't have trees, some do. But trees are really great because they add to the potential biodiversity of an ecosystem. So with trees, which means we can get more birds in here, which means we can have animals which hide in the trees. So yeah, that's a grassland. This is our grassland area. So this is an example of a mark left by a larger mammal. Now, as I was saying, when there are trees around, it means that there's more potential for biodiversity. So in this scenario, this is an example of where a deer has come through here and used the tree for a particular purpose. Now, as we can see, the tree has been damaged. It's got all this scarring on the bark. And the reason for that is twofold. At the end of summer, deer with antlers, so the males, the bucks, they rub their antlers against these trees. And they do that because there's a coating on their antlers that needs to be rubbed off. It's probably itchy in the summer sun. But the other reason is that they are covering their scent on the trees, so that they're marking their territory. So the antlers have their scent on them, and they want to spread it on the tree so that other deer know that this is their territory. We're now in a forest ecosystem. This is a hemlock forest, which means that most of the trees in this area are hemlocks, which are in the pine family. They're an evergreen tree. Now, as you can see, there's a big difference between an open grassland and a dark forest like this just by the light. So there's a bit of dappled light, but most of the forest is covered by canopy, which is the tops of trees which shade below. That means that there's cover from sunlight. It means that it's a little cooler, but it also means that in this forest, lots of things can hide. So in the ground, underneath all the debris, there's going to be beetles and worms and little bugs. We've got things like raccoons and possums that scrounge for those bugs. And then we've also got tons and tons of birds. Birds love forests because they hide in trees, they like the cool air, and they like to be covered. Now, a few different types of birds that we would have in this area. The nice thing about forests is you can get big, big birds. You can get big turkeys, wild turkeys that roam the forest, and other birds like grouse, which are big, big birds that flutter around, but mostly they walk on the ground. But you can also get some really cool birds like woodpeckers. So woodpeckers love the forest because that's where they get their food and that's where they make their home. they get their food by smashing their beaks into the tree so they can pull out insects. Let's go take a look at one of those. So what we're looking at here are giant holes made by woodpeckers. You can see this is a big and open one, but they can also be small like this, where they're just trying to get some food, just trying to find little grubs and little beetles that are behind the bark that they can eat. But this tree is just covered with woodpecker holes. We're now at a pond ecosystem. Now the one thing that we haven't been able to find in the other ecosystems we've been looking at is fish. So fish are a huge part of the pond ecosystem. They're providing nutrients for the ground, the plants that are underneath the water and are attached to the bottom of the pond. They're also eating little insects that come to the surface of the pond. Well, what's important for fish and for other species that live around a pond is shade. And so, see the trees and the grasses and the shrubs that come up around the pond that give shade to the pond. That's really good. It helps cool the temperature down, because in these parts, our ponds and our streams are a pretty cool temperature. So when you have a pond that's sitting like this, you want a lot of shade around it. The other thing we'll see is we have birds again. Now a lot of these are actually the same birds. The term we mentioned before is aerial insectivore. In this case, what they're doing is they're flying down, and without landing, they're grabbing insects off of the pond. The other thing they're doing, not just grabbing food, but they're also grabbing bits of grass and twigs to help build their nests. Now, right before we got here, there was a little muskrat that was sitting at the edge of the pond here. So that just shows you that mammals are also present in a water ecosystem like this. And as we approached, he dove under the water. But the water here is central. The water is what makes this ecosystem. But there are a whole bunch of other components, like the fish and the insects and the birds and the mammals and the shrubs and trees, that make sure that water and this ecosystem stay healthy. So this is an example of an aquatic food web. As you can see, there are a couple levels of energy transfer. Now, the first one starts with plants. That's where things begin. They rise out of the soil, which has nutrients, and they hold nutrients themselves. And then they're able to pass that on to a variety of different organisms, like prawns and other kind of crayfish and that type of thing, to certain kinds of fish, to flies and to slugs, so different insects. And then that energy is then transferred onto things like more fish. Fish eat flies and slugs and prawns. Dragonflies are actually meat eaters as well, and they eat different types of insects. And then you have turtles, which will eat slugs and insects as well. So as you can see, the energy continues to transfer up the food chain here. And lastly, on this example, we have birds and we have frogs and we have snakes. So these are in the pond system. These are some of the top predators. So they're eating fish and insects. They're eating dragonflies, and they're actually also eating farther back. So not all things are in a perfect line, but while frogs eat dragonflies, they also eat flies. So the system is actually pretty complex, even with just a few organisms, and this is only the beginning of them.
I hope you enjoyed walking around Cedar Haven and seeing some of the different ecosystems that we have here. As we wrap up, there's just a few questions I wanted to bring up just for us to think through together, and then that will be all. So the first question that I want to think about is, where are we in these ecosystems? So we've talked about different kinds of plants and insects and birds and animals and how they're all interacting, but we haven't really talked about us and where we are on the ecosystem. If we think about what we eat a lot of different things, but really we are at the top of a lot of these ecosystems, which means that we might be consuming some of those mammals, we might be consuming some of those plants. So we're really at the top. So what we do has a really big impact on the rest of these ecosystems. So we need to be really mindful of how we're treating and interacting with these ecosystems to make sure that we do that with care and respect. The second question I want to ask is, what happens if we lose a part of one of these ecosystems? So what happens if we lose plants, or what happens if we lose birds or insects? If one of those things just disappeared, what would happen? the unique thing about ecosystems is that they're all so interdependent and interconnected, so that if we lose one part of it, the whole ecosystem suffers, both the things below it on the food chain and the things above it. So if we lost all insects, well, that's going to have a really big impact on the birds, which will have a big impact on all other mammals, which really will have an impact on us and what we are able to consume and eat and interact with as well. So another thing to remember is everything is so connected that if we lose just one small part of an ecosystem, it really has negative effects for all different parts of the ecosystem. And the last thing for you to take away is wherever you're viewing this from, I encourage you to go outside and look at the environment around you. See if you can figure out what kind of ecosystems there are around you, or if you can maybe piece together how that transfer of energy moves across the food chain in your ecosystems, wherever you are. So it might be helpful to think of it in terms of what eats what. So when you're looking for different kinds of insects and small animals or mammals and plants, so go outside and see if you can identify different parts of the ecosystems around you. So that's all for today. We hope that you enjoyed learning about ecosystems with us, and we hope to see you again sometime.